I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land we're gathering on today. I extend my respects to elders past and present, and indeed all First Nations people here today. My name's Janice Peterson. I'm a journalist. I read the news on SBS most nights of the week, and I hope I'm a familiar face to at least some of you. I'm also the daughter of South African parents, people who came to Australia, who had to flee a country they loved because that particular regime at that particular time in the 70s implemented what's called the apartheid system. And by virtue of their skin colour, their lives were deemed to be worth less than others. And shockingly, more than others, the majority population, a shocking, despicable system that, thank goodness, isn't in play today, but the vestiges and the legacy remains. Divide and conquer. They found safety in Australia, a magnificent country for sure, but one which, of course, still rankles and deals with its own sorry history when it comes to race relations. And yet not every family is as fortunate as mine. I understand that luck is not distributed randomly. It's a decision about whose lives are worth protecting and whose are not. Women in conflict zones aren't falling through the cracks of a well-designed system that's well-intentioned. They're being placed outside of a system that's working perfectly as it was built. It decided whose safety was worth enforcing and whose was not. And that is the argument that every single person you'll hear from today is going to build on throughout this session from a different position and a different perspective and life experience. So we begin not with a framework, we begin with evidence. Dr. Eden Alim is a medical doctor from the Tigray region in Ethiopia. She's going to tell us what she's seen.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning, everyone. On a late Tuesday evening in November 2020, an armed conflict broke out between the federal government of Ethiopia and the regional government of Tigray, also spreading to other parts of the country and neighboring countries. The moment the conflict erupted, the people of Tigray were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Telecommunications, including mobile networks, internet, were completely shut off. People couldn't leave the region because roads were closed and planes stopped flying. Banks were closed. People couldn't access any of their savings. Civil servants, including health workers, didn't receive salaries. And food, medicine, fuel, that couldn't come into the region either, be it commercially or by humanitarian organizations. The movement of humanitarian workers themselves was greatly restricted, and some even lost their lives in the process. It wasn't just soldiers dying in battlefields. Civilians were the ones being killed in masses. Children were the ones going hungry and dying as starvation and famine were used as strategies of war. It was girls and women who were being raped, held in sexual slavery, and who had foreign objects inserted into their wombs. They couldn't speak of what they suffered out of fear of stigma, and they can't seek justice because the perpetrators are practically immune. Mothers were giving birth at home as ambulances lacked fuel to take them to hospitals, and hospitals ran out of medicines, so that even when health professionals continued going there and showing up, which they did even without salaries, they lacked the resources to provide care. Over the course of the conflict, maternal deaths increased nearly fivefold, and 90% of health facilities were either partially or fully damaged. During the time, out of a 7 million population, an estimated 600,000 people died. According to the Interagency Humanitarian Evaluation Report on the crisis, the people of Tigray lived through extreme levels of violence against civilians and faced grave and systematic violations of international law, amounting to crimes against humanity and war crimes. The active conflict went on until the signing of a cessation of hostilities in 2022. This agreement silenced the guns and led to a resumption of services, despite their shortcomings. However, the suffering is far from over. Poverty in Tigray increased from 27% to 45% in 2022. Youth and skilled professionals, including healthcare workers, are migrating out of the region. There are still 750,000 internally displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of ex-combatants, many of whom have sustained disabilities. The consequent economic burden rests heavily on the shoulders of girls and women. It's the girl child that the family resort to send off to marriage instead of school. It's the girls who resort to sex work to feed their families. And for no faults of their own, it's the survivors who are blamed and stigmatized for the rest of their lives. During the phase of active conflict, humanitarian actors had extremely limited space to operate. But even within these constraints, the support that was provided by the international community through the United Nations, NGOs working with local institutions, it was critical, and it saved countless lives. Today, the circumstances in Tigray remain volatile. Tensions between the regional and federal government, with neighboring countries and within opposing parties of the region keep escalating, and the future is uncertain as the people continue to live in fear that renewed conflict may reignite any day. However, reproductive health services, especially in humanitarian settings, are never just about service delivery. It's shaped by power, by politics, by insecurity, and by those that control resources. And we cannot continue to live in a world where no one is held responsible for tragedies, where there's no accountability, and where victims are forgotten or blamed, and where justice is only a concept on paper. In their daily lives, the people of Tigray, the girls and the mothers, the survivors, they continue to struggle for peace, for access to their basic dignity and rights, for justice, and for their voices to be heard. At a time where they need the solidarity the most, I ask you, please choose to stand with them. Thank you.
Actually, I might head on over to this part of the stage. You've heard the evidence there. I'd like to now introduce 4 people who are going to help us build this argument. And a warning, this next discussion contains mentions of genocide and sexual violence. So please take care, and you know where the exits are if you need to take a beat. Noor Aziza is the co-founder and director of the Rohingya Maya Funo Collaborative Network. She spent many, many years working inside the community that the international protection system has documented, discussed, and consistently failed to protect. Noor, do you want to come on out? Minister Chernobyl is Minister for Information and Civic Education in Sierra Leone. He travelled a long way to be here. Co-founder of We Are Purposeful. He sits inside government and inside the movement simultaneously, which is a pretty rare and revealing position. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. It's our great delight to have Dr. June Oscar, founder and chair of Yi Yani Uthangi Institute. As you can see, among her other notable achievements is being an absolute legend, very much at the forefront of First Nations gender justice. She spent many, many decades at the intersection of First Nations rights, colonialism, and legal systems. We also have Suzanne Legina, CEO of Plan International Australia. Plan operates across many different conflict contexts globally, including where women-led organisations are first responders, but as we know, often last to be funded. Please welcome our panellists. So we've just heard from Dr. Alem. That's not context, it is the evidence base for everything that follows. So the question that this panel asks is not whether people and women in conflict are suffering. We know that's well established. The question really centres around the international protection framework, which exists. It's been in place for many, many years, but it consistently fails to protect them. So we will be talking about whether that system and that structure is accidental or built exactly the way it's supposed to be operating. Noor, the Rohingya genocide has been named, it's been documented for many, many years. But people have short attention spans, don't they? There's always another crisis that's bubbling up. What's the price of that attention being diverted elsewhere, and what have you and your community had to build yourselves in place of support that's evaporated?
So the Rohingya people are, according to the United Nations, the most persecuted people in the entire world today. Just for context, Rohingya are an indigenous ethnic group from the country Myanmar, Burma, and we've faced genocide, ethnic cleansing, displacements for the last 84 years. I myself am a survivor. I fled Myanmar with my family in the 90s when the main perpetrator, the Myanmar military, came to our village and they were burning villages to the ground, raping women, burning children and babies alive. And my mother carried 5 of her children across the borders of Southeast Asia. We took every mode of transportation possible. We took every train, every bus. We walked. And no mother, for mothers out there in the audience, would never carry their children across the ocean when it's clearly not safe to do so. But being on the run was much more safer than being in our ancestral homeland. And then I lived as a refugee in Malaysia for 8 years and a half until the Australian government and the people of Gadigal granted my family and I asylum. But this genocide is still ongoing. Despite it not being on the news, people are still being killed, people are still being persecuted. It is one of the most gendered genocides of our time. And just a bit of a trigger warning, part of the work that we do at Rohingya Maya Whānau Collaborative Network is collect evidence and testimonies. And there was a testimony that really, I couldn't sleep for like a couple of days. It was from a 6-year-old child, a 6-year-old girl in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, which is the largest refugee camp in the world today. This 6-year-old child said, "I feel lucky because I was raped by 10 Myanmar military officers." And she said, "I feel lucky because my friends were raped by 3. The other way around. She said, "I feel lucky that I was raped by 3 Myanmar military officers because my friends were raped by 10. A 6-year-old child told me that. And I couldn't sleep for weeks. And this is just one story. In 2017, more than 25,000 Rohingya women were raped and gang raped. So today we are seeing mass displacement across ASEAN, and luckily Australia has granted asylum to a very small number of Rohingya communities, but it is dire and we need public support because collective amnesia will never end a single genocide.
Suzanne, Plan International is one of the biggest humanitarian organisations in the world. You work in many contexts that Noor has just described, where that money that is promised doesn't actually reach where it needs to go. What role has Plan played in that, even unintentionally? Take us behind the scenes.
I think we've talked a lot in this conference about how that international infrastructure created 80 years ago, top-down, built to have the accountability up to donors, to not be accountable to the people you serve, to flow money through. Plan was created 80 years ago too, so we grew up alongside the system. And in some ways we replicated the system, became inside the system. But what you're seeing on the ground is that use of like red tape, risk aversion, and holding on to resources that stops that money from flowing. And it turns up in like consultations with women and a photograph with the UN delegation. I'm sure this happens in the Rohingya camp as well, who then, when that's gone, get none of the funding. Where girls are, young girls in Rohingya, girls in the Cox's Bazar tell us, they're stuck inside. Even what is decided as life-saving, food, water, shelter, but freedom from violence, education in emergencies, not even included in there. So I would say organisations like ours, we've got the fourth R, which is really this reckoning with ourselves and with the role that we have to play. But the opponents in the world who are making war and creating war, they work across sectors and they are transnational too. Private actors, surveillance, AI companies, extraction companies, logistics firms, consulting firms. And so I think as we remake ourselves, there's still value for us to hold state actors to account, but even more importantly for global organisations like ours, we have to release the funding. Obviously, we've got to hold the risk like a force field to protect those young girls from the things they're experiencing and get them the support, the mental health support and all the other things they need. And we have to start really shining a light on this invisible, largely invisible, mostly not accountable group of actors that are connected to us all in some way, either through the investments we make, the companies we serve, the things we buy. And we have to start building out that other infrastructure, the alternative one, that'll create a different kind of network, more resilient, more focused on really the dignity of the person at the centre rather than the destruction of the world as we know it.
Thanks, Suzanne. Minister, you have quite a unique position really of sitting inside government and also inside a movement. When protection language is used to justify decisions that exclude women, who's behind the scenes in these rooms where big decisions are being made? Who is in those rooms calling this out?
Thank you very much. It's such an honor and a privilege to be with you all and to be on this really, truly incredible panel. For me, I think the equation is simple. I grew up in war, and I've had the privilege of being part of responding to different sets of crises. So the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone that you're aware of, COVID, and I worked in the humanitarian sector as well. What I've always seen in reality is what we hear in the conversations here. That women and girls, particularly young women, are organizing, are responding, are documenting, are the people that give us food. It was my mom that helped us to get out of the situation that we are, that are teaching our kids, that are providing the education in the midst of this crisis with very little resources. And what I found astounding, being in the room, are the reasons why the resources are not even naming the people who are the leaders of the response. And I think you alluded to that a little bit. We used to call it at Purposeful that you are eliminated by complexity. Yeah. The system is so complex and bureaucratic that you don't even have access to it. Means of getting resources, well, it's too risky for you to be given these monies that you need to do the work that you need to do to lead this work. And then, the systems of accountability do not allow us to get you the resources that you need. So you see this paradox. The reality of it is this paradoxical system. And what we try to do at We Are Purposeful, which I was privileged to co-found with some incredible feminists who are with us in this room. I see Nadia, Josephine, Rosa, Dr. Bangura, and others, is to be irrational about what we were being told and how we've been socialized. To trust radically and trust with love. To give as much resources as we could. First, with the Ebola response, that's how this organization was built. Because we saw what was happening. Girls were at the forefront of the response, and yet almost all the reports that were coming out of Ebola barely mentioned the work that girls and women were doing in the first place. And so when COVID hit, the experience that Purposeful used was mobilize resources, gave money to over 640 organizations across the world, from Afghanistan to DRC, in places that are forgotten. And one of the things that Purposeful is most proud of is about 1/4 of that money went to organizations that were led by girls who are under 19 years old, girls who will not be considered otherwise, and monies that are given to them in ways that they want within 24 hours, without requirements of bureaucracy, sometimes without paperwork, without requirements for registration. The reason I think that's important is because these feminist leaders, young women and girls, were doing this work anyway. Without this money, this is the reality. This is the work that they will do anyway. And this money, which is available, which they're doing by just getting, the global aid money that goes into, the percentage of money that goes to women's rights organizations, as most of you know, is less than about 0.34%. But they are leading this work. So I think when you ask about what the gap is and who is making these decisions in this room, it's the fact that the decisions are being made based on a system that we have all been socialized into, with this bureaucracy, with this idea of what the norms are, what the patterns are, but these do not fit the reality of what we've all seen, what we experienced, what I saw growing up in war, what I've seen in Ebola, what I've seen in COVID, and what we see every day in the realities of our lives.
Thank you.
That needs to change.
Dr. June, Oscar, riddle me this. This is something that I've found sort of endlessly fascinating and frustrating, and that is that the very people who are most failed by a system are often turned to come up with a solution. Isn't that a conundrum? So tell me, can a colonial framework decolonise itself?
Well, we can certainly drive that, but before I begin, I want to acknowledge we gather on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their leaders, their elders. Thank you. Well, in this country, we live in the aftermath of frontier wars, the first wars of this nation state. Never recognised, never reckoned with. When that happens, the real work of peace building is never done. Colonial structures are left intact because they are never understood as perpetrators. And so an insidious war continues to wage. We have not learnt to substantively reconcile here, to truly coexist with different worldviews, practices, governance, and law. Division remains embedded in our structures, with racism and sexism and the many intersecting isms holding it in place. For our peoples, we remain the most marginalised, the most harmed by violence, the most impoverished. This is a consequence of war, of unresolved, unacknowledged conflict. Before the colonial invasion, we were a people of balance and equilibrium, of intergenerational health and peace. And then imagine living with grief layered on grief, generations after generations after generations. That is the reality for so many of our communities in Australia. We cannot pretend that for many of our communities, we still live in warlike environments. This is not something wrong with us. This is state-sanctioned violence, a refusal to admit what has happened, a refusal to truly rectify it. So this is what we've come to share and to tell all of you. You cannot ignore war and unresolved trauma and expect peace to follow. It does not work that way. Dialogues and actions of peace are the only path to restoration, to recovery, to truth, and genuine interconnection between peoples. The practices required to build peace are deeply embedded in our cultures. We know that. We know how to adapt to survive and thrive, and know how to restore equilibrium. We have always known that. And Millie from the Solomon Islands, thank you. This is our AI, our ancestral intelligence. So I deeply believe it is First Nations women and girls and gender diverse peoples who can show the way forward through our weaving of the social fabric. Women building reconstruction everywhere with love and with deep care. That is the work of Wiyaniu Dangani, Institute for First Nations Gender Justice. So thank you, Anyanija.
I think we'll all meditate on the new June's version of AI, ancestral intelligence, something to certainly marinate on. Dr. Oscar also talked about the cost of waiting for peace. Noah, I want to bring you back in. You talked about the cost of waiting for support when all sorts of things like genocide, massive things, have already been named. What has that waiting cost for your community felt like? What is the price of that? And what does it tell you about the international protection system? Is it a system that's tried and failed, or is it a system that was never actually designed to succeed for your community?
Just to highlight what we are doing at Rohingya Women Collaborative Network, my organisation, we visit the Rohingya refugee camps across the world in Bangladesh, Indonesia. Our people are in detention in Malaysia, in Thailand as well. I was in Indonesia last year in Aceh. There are 7 Rohingya refugee camps. So we've had to step up and provide care to our people that are escaping the violence in Myanmar. And some of the stories that I hear are so grotesque. And there is a huge global humanitarian funding cut. In the camp in Bangladesh, people are living on $7 a month now. It used to be $12 a month, but $7 a month. That's nothing. You cannot even buy a packet of noodles for 20 cents a day. So because of this, we're also seeing sea arrivals, people escaping Bangladesh and trying to look for a better life in Malaysia and Indonesia. And last year in Indonesia, just to give you specific context on what we did to step up, is 6 Rohingya women jumped on a boat across the Andaman Sea, and a human trafficker on the boat raped all these 6 women. They arrived in Aceh, Indonesia, all pregnant. Aceh is Islamic Sharia law. There is no access to abortion. So we were the first organization to step up and provide gender-sensitive care to these 6 women that have faced such atrocities in Myanmar and beyond now. So this violence is beyond Myanmar. They've all given birth. And I went to see them, and these women are carrying such traumas because the system has failed them. The system did not protect them in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, and now in Indonesia. Some of the camps are on the beach. No roof, 40 degree, the children have no education. So as an organization, we had to step up and provide care to these women, and we continue to do so. We have programs for 81 unaccompanied Rohingya children in the camp in Indonesia. These children held onto debris, watching their parents drown in the ocean. Just last week, a boat of 250 Rohingya tried to flee and arrive in Malaysia. There's no safe landing in Malaysia. They all drowned. They're all missing. This could have been prevented if there was safe landing, if there was policy in place to protect the most persecuted people in the entire world today. Shameless plug, you can follow our page on Rohingya Women Collaborative on Instagram.
Thank you. Minister Barr, what's your response to some of Noor's testimony?
As I said, I grew up in Sierra Leone during the conflict. And I've had the privilege of visiting Myanmar with We Are Purposeful before I became a government minister. And I think what my sister is speaking about here is a shame to all of humanity, frankly, to the global system. But I think the question you were asking, and this is something that particularly for us who are black, brown people, is that the system of global aid was never meant for our salvation. It was never meant to, it was not designed for our freedom. It was designed to keep us as second-class human beings, and it becomes manifested mostly in times of conflict. And what I've learned about conflict and emergencies is that they exacerbate what is already the norm. And I think we're seeing the worst parts of it with the Rohingya people, and also with other conflicts that are going on in the world today that sometimes we're even afraid to talk about. Especially when the sad part is the fear increases with the more power you have. So for those of us, for example, who are in governments, now I have many things I would like to say, but as a government minister, you're limited. People who hold positions of power in some organizations are afraid to speak up because the risk of speaking up cuts off your funding, being shut out of different rooms and all of that. And that's why I think these kinds of convenings are so powerful. I think I get my own radicalization from coming to Women Deliver since 2007 in London. I was there. And I grew up in this movement. And that's why being in the room today as a government minister, I speak the way I speak. I stand up for the things I stand up for. But I say that it has to go beyond mere words here. It has to be about what are we willing to risk? What power are we willing to risk to change it? Because I know we can if we dare. And the question is, are we in this room, are folks who are part of this community willing to dare? And it's a big question always that you have to grapple with. But that's all I can offer right now.
Thank you. So, Sudan, obviously Plan International does great work, but you've acknowledged yourself, and I thought that was a very generous thing to do in front of this audience here, to acknowledge that there are gaps. Given what you've heard today from our speakers, what do you think you're going to take back and action after hearing this sort of testimony? How can you affect change at Plan and try and get that aid to where it's needed?
I mean, it's hard to follow from what you've said, but clearly our role is to evolve our role, is to loosen power, to get more resources to the people on the front line who are doing that actual work. I thought what you said before, I mean, we haven't really acknowledged that, but how women and girls' bodies are literally on the line in so many places around the world today, and you could name where they are, and how that is being used so powerfully in this moment. It's like a, and to get attention, you talked about the brown and black people, but I'm talking about the global minority, people like me, how difficult it is to get our governments, our media and other people to pay attention to focus on those places. So we use our power to shine a light, to keep the fire burning. I think the thing I'm going to do is hold a fire to my own organisation, keep the heat on my own governments. We have to keep finding ways together. I need other organisations and sister organisations to hold us accountable too for the change that we're trying to make on the ground. We can't leave here without creating something different, or we fail everybody. So we're trying to get money into the hands of those girls. We're taking our lead from Purposeful and others who've already shown us the way to do it. We've modelled ourselves on what they do. No red tape, no bureaucracy, high trust, more visibility, money into the hands of the girls themselves through our Girl Accelerator. So there are already glimmers of how to do it. So rather than leading now, we're following.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And Dr. June, Oscar, I might leave the last word with you. If you're able to zip through this very big question in just a minute, if I can put the stopwatch on you. There are people in this room today who make big decisions. What do you want them to know before they leave here today? What do you need them to do?
If there are people who are absolutely committed to gender justice and equality, make sure there's seats around that table for those who need to be there from First Nations, Indigenous communities.
What a legend. On that note, I think we might say a big thank you to our panel, and then I'll introduce our next speaker. Please thank Suzanne Ledina, Dr. June Oscar, Minister Chernabar, and Noor Aziza. Thank you. What legends. Well, friends, the protection framework is not failing women, as we've just heard. It's functioning just as designed for those whose protection was prioritised when it was designed. What follows is not going to be a break from that argument. It's actually the same argument in a different register. Our next guest will speak as a Palestinian woman. She will speak first as a Palestinian woman, and then she will play. Both carry equal weight, and I'll make my way over to the stage here. But I'm really looking forward to this. Friends, please welcome Simona Abdallah.
I acknowledge the owners of the land. I stand here today as an artist and as a Palestinian. Being Palestinian is not just where I come from. It's something I carry in my body, in my breath, and in my rhythm. I grew up with stories of roots, of belonging, of people holding into dignity while living under constant occupation. When you witness life being erased and humanity denied over time, it becomes impossible not to feel that as genocide. And when I speak about my people, I speak with grief that I decided not to paralyze me, but turn into living, into acting. I play music because it unites us and gives us space to deal with our collective and individual trauma. But I'm not only here to speak about pain. I'm here because of my instrument, because of its healing energy for myself and others. I'm here for something that unites us, because even in the midst of war, in my Arabic culture, we turn into music to connect and to find moment beyond the pain. Even in places like Gaza, children are still taught to sing, to play, to express, and to heal. Rhythm is something that we all share across cultures and across our differences. This is my way of gathering us through rhythm, through energy, and through unity. So let's feel that together. Thank you, and free Palestine.
So friends, the law exists, the commitment exists somewhere. The question this plenary is about to ask is why none of that has been enough. And who benefits from that insufficiency? Our next panel is a big one. I think it's about to get pretty loud in here. I want to introduce the four people who are about to rip into that question. Leila Alodat is Executive Director of Prospera. She works at the intersection of resourcing law and the accountability gap. Welcome, Leila. Dame Jacinda Ardern served as Prime Minister. Do I really need to say this? Served as Prime Minister of New Zealand. She's spoken so publicly. Dame Jacinda Ardern has spoken very publicly and frequently at significant political cost about the protection of women and girls in conflict. Needless to say, Dame Jacinda Ardern, happy to have you here, mate.
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Zora is a queer Afghan refugee activist navigating an international community that has largely chosen to accept the regime that's made her existence illegal. Welcome, Zora. Thank you, Zora. And Tamam Abdul Salama was born and raised in Jabalia refugee camp. Today, she leads a European Citizens Initiative asking the EU to apply the law that already exists. Again, please welcome our friends to the stage. What a powerhouse panel to end this plenary. Leila, women-led organisations working in conflict settings are, as we know, chronically underfunded. They're not consistently supported. They're excluded from all sorts of tables and rooms where decisions are made. So what's the relationship between resourcing failure and accountability failure? And are they the same thing?
Thank you so much, Janice, and hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri and Bun Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I honor their unbroken spiritual, cultural, and political connection to this place. I recognize their ongoing custodianship. I also want to recognize Simona, who, with her music, she brought part of my people and my land to this room. And thank you for starting this discussion by accountability. Accountability often gets brought as an abstract value, like something for a mission statement or a billboard. The truth is, accountability is a process, and it's built on the basis that humans' life has worth, that harm that is imposed on them has consequences, and that demands repair. And the accountability failure that you are mentioning is built and rooted in a racialized gender system that renders some lives unworthy. They're not worthy of protection. The harm done to them does not trigger outrage or consequences, and definitely does not demand repair. We render their suffering normalized and diminish their humanity. And to understand the depth to which this shapes our life, I would like us to think of what we consume in international news every day. Televised genocides, referring to atrocities in the passive tense, state-funded horror, and the use of referring to the trade of arms as a viable financial endeavor. And I want us all to think of that international news as local news. Think of it that it's happening here in Melbourne, or maybe in London, where I live. Imagine listening to your local news and hearing that hundreds and hundreds of kids in the next neighborhood have been killed using arms that are state-funded, and the sale of these arms have added 2 points to our national GDP. And now the weather. If this sounds inconceivable, if this is not something that gets said about your people and about your land on a daily basis, then you belong to an ever-shrinking minority whose lives are still of worth, who still ignite accountability. And everyone else is in a spectrum of disposable lives. They're dehumanized. And if they are dehumanized, then they're funded as subhumans. So we fund them to keep them above the breadline. We fill their stomachs so they can go back to toil in labor, paid or unpaid. And we never address the root causes of their victimization. And at the same time, we abundantly fund the conditions, the roots that put them in that place. The humanitarian system loves to use lives saved. It's the currency that is used, and lives are saved. But unfortunately, they get sent back to spend these lives in destitution, under occupation, in displacement, and it does not acknowledge the dignity and the intrinsic values for these communities. But the communities they've never ever been just the recipients of charity. They have always organized, came together, and said how they would like to be sustained by their own people. They said we'd like funding to come to us proximately, we'd like the decision made in the community, and we'd like to be funded in a way that address both our immediate harm and long-term transition. And they've done things about it. I have the privilege of working with women and feminist funds every day. They are the community's way of responding to how they have been resourced in the past. They come close to the community and resource with respect, with abundance, and that has worked. Today, 55% of those responding on the front line to the most horrific situations consider women and feminist funds to be a significant part of their resources. 40% think it's the majority of their resources come from them. That is accountability. That is bringing it back to the community and making sure that it serves their dignity and well-being.
Thank you, Leila. Jacinda, among many things we've just heard Leila talk about, she did talk about the realities of watching these conflicts play out on our TV screens and our screens. But when a lot of leaders talk about women in conflict, they talk about other governments. So for you, are you able to talk about your time at the top? Tell me about a decision you made or didn't make that haunts you most when you watch TV news?
Do you know, reflecting on my time in office, one of the emotions that I remember feeling during various conflicts is the tyranny of distance. And so I do want to give a little specific shout out to anyone here who is a member of the Pacific community. There they are. New Zealand is proudly a part of the Pacific family. And we at times can feel distant from the world, and perhaps that sometimes can breed the sense of isolation from the conflicts that we observe. However, we are also a region who has always understood how connected we are. And so I think one of the things that I would want to share is that regardless of where in the world we are seeing women's rights reduced, diminished, challenged, there is always something you can do. So when I had the privilege of being the Prime Minister of New Zealand, a nation of 5 million people at the bottom of the world, when we saw the humanitarian crisis affecting the Rohingya people in Myanmar, we still had the ability to say, well, our aid will go to NGOs and it will specifically also go to focus on supporting women and girls. When we saw women campaign in the streets for their rights in Iran, that was a moment in time where we could say, well, we will stand up and call for the removal of Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women because they do not deserve to debate the rights of women while the rights of women are being suppressed in that nation. Or as we saw crisis unfold in Afghanistan, you know, as a nation, one thing we could do was very, very deliberately reach out and give safe haven to women in public office and public life in Afghanistan to find sanctuary in New Zealand so long as they needed it. There is always something that you can do. The second point that I would make, now that I'm out of office, I've become particularly aware that the need is growing. The need is growing as we see nations who have previously funded the rights of women and girls withdraw. We see the need increase. And as that need increases, one of the areas that perhaps feels the impact of that the most is those harder to reach areas. To give you an example, women giving birth in conflict. Now, we know that one of the greatest causes of death for women in birth is postpartum hemorrhaging. 14 million women affected by it, 1 every 7 minutes. But you are twice as likely to die if you are in a conflict zone. Now, we know that. We know what we need to do, but we also know of the amazing organisations that are out there. Previously, Neve's been so great that conflict has been last cab off the rank. We have organisations out there who are willing and ready to go into those hardest to reach areas who just need the resourcing and those who are bold enough to fund it. So the second point that I would make is in these difficult times, we can't retreat from the hardest areas. We must lean into them. And so my reflections now, one from a perspective of in office, the other from the perspective now of someone working in this safer birthing project alongside the IRC, would just be keep leaning in. Don't retreat. Lean harder.
Lean harder. Thank you so much, Jacinda. To you now, Zora, a queer Afghan woman living under a regime that's seems to be gaining more acceptance from the international community. What's the reality of that like for you, and who is the international protection system actually protecting at the moment, do you think?
Well, not us. That's very clear. The reason I'm here is because the SIT international community has failed. Maybe I can give a little history lesson. The Bonn Agreement in 2021 was signed outside Afghanistan. The last peace treaty was signed outside Afghanistan. We had Women, Peace, Security Agenda. We had a women's ministry. We had elimination of violence against women law and the units to implement it. We had one of the largest members of the parliament that were women. Where are they now? We had national action plans to increase the political participation of women. It just all became redundant. And I am here as a direct result of that conflict that was in Afghanistan. My parents fled Afghanistan because of the war. Their parents fled Afghanistan because of the war. I am now displaced. I'm a refugee. My siblings' children are the next generation that are displaced, and their children will also experience the same thing. So that's 5 generations, 1 family. And I ask every single one of you to imagine how that's like. We talk about displacement, but that also includes a place to go back to. And I've talked to a lot of colleagues here. Even here in this place, we are replicating the same system. We're replicating the same structures. I've heard so many times colleagues saying that they're not getting into the right rooms. You talked about distance, and it's also here, right? And it's wonderful, and I think it's incredible that women are still fighting because we don't have the resources. And we're not even able to get in 10 meters of people with all the power and authority and resources. So when it comes to redistribution of power and resources, we're not in the right rooms. But we know these rooms are where decisions are being made about our lives. So the question is, why aren't we there? And I think asking the system that is built to oppress and to exclude and to marginalize, asking the same system to work for us, it's not going to get us anywhere. And also the suggestion, I think, that we need alternatives. We do have alternatives. We're doing it. Women in conflict, women in Afghanistan, Iran, in Palestine, women everywhere. We're surviving every single day. We have the means. We know how to do it. Alternatives are there. So I think it's just that. Just a little bit of reflection of what is happening and what it does, what conflict does to an actual human being, right? That we always forget about that. We forget about the lives of people. We talk about numbers. It becomes just incredibly difficult to then narrow it down to remember that we're talking about humans.
Thank you so much, Zora. Tamam, Zora's spoken there about generational trauma, generational displacement. You yourself were born in Jabalia refugee camp, a place that exists because of a protection failure that's now around, I think, 7 decades old. The campaign you lead isn't asking for new laws, it's actually asking the EU to apply the law that already exists. What does that tell you about international accountability?
First, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the owners of the land and pay respect to their past, present, and future. I would like also to invite all of you to remember the lives of over 75,000 Palestinian women, men, and children who have been murdered brutally before our own eyes by Israel. This includes 28,000 women. I would like also to name some of them who are very dear family members, friends, and colleagues. My uncle Marwan, Auntie Hania, their children, my cousins Wasim and Youssef, and many more. I also would like to invite you to remember the 38 Palestinian women who have been held unlawfully inside Israel's prisons. I would also pay respect to every Palestinian woman who has exhausted all her resources to keep the community together and to ensure the continuity of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and justice. And I just want to make a very important, but a quick remark on the title of this panel. What is happening in Palestine is not merely a conflict. It is a colonial occupation. And words do matter. When we use the term conflict, it implies that there is two equal sides. But under colonial occupation, there is an occupier and occupied. And I also don't want to talk only about women and girls of Palestine. I also want to talk about our men, our freedom fighters, our brothers, our lovers, our uncles, our partners, my cousins, all of them, because their lives matter, and the focus on women and girls do legitimize their killing and their their criminalization. Coming back to your question, the international accountability system has been designed and built by Western powers to protect their own interests and to protect those who are powerful from accountability, from justice, all at the expense of the lives and bodies of racialized communities, of minorities, of people of the global north. So this system is not actually automatically responsive. And we see that it only responds when we protest, when we come together, when we organize, when we strategize, when we mobilize, when we force them actually to act. And that's very important because it gives us it makes it clear for all of us that rights are unfortunately not guaranteed, but are fought for. And I think here we have to understand and we have to acknowledge that it's time to stop asking such systems that are built on colonial legacy, on racism, on exclusion, to fix themselves. Such systems cannot be fixed. They have to be dismantled. And we, the people, with all of you, have to start building and imagining a power that operates outside and against this colonial, racist logic for the people, not for the powerful amongst all of us.
Thank you so much, Tamam. Leila, you've heard what Tamam has to say about needing to dismantle these sorts of systems. If we look at humanitarian funding, it still seems to be channeled through international intermediaries. It doesn't get to those local women-led organisations or the people that need it on the ground. Just briefly, tell us about the impact of that.
Thank you. Listen, international humanitarian organizations save lives. That's granted. However, it's again a matter of accountability. They are accountable to states, they're accountable to systems, they're not accountable to the people. And the problem with that is that renders some of the principles that were initially means to an end to be the end themselves. Look at neutrality. Neutrality was there to guarantee access to population in danger. At the moment, we're seeing, at this level of atrocities, we're seeing international humanitarian organizations serving neutrality itself rather than the people. We get 10 out of 10 on neutrality, but the population is obliterated. State is happy, people are not. If we want the protection of the people, we need to see exactly the most marginalized of them. How do they feel protected and safe? How do the LGBT community, disabled people, women, people who are not seen by systems, how do they feel safe? And regularly, they tell us fair wages, safe access to health services, control of arms. The things that they want is what gets the community grounded and allow people to live with dignity. And seeing this and seeing who they trust, who has sourced them with loyalty, and look at them as not dispensable lives. Who are the people who serve them from the community? Women-led organizations are not delivering this because they are different in how they're formed. It's because they are from this community. The community is their children and their parents, and they're not dispensable to them. So we need to resource them with this knowledge and with the ability to differentiate what the accountability system is and what is it for the people. Thank you.
Thanks, Leila. Jacinda, of course, you're not in government these days. Don't know if that's a relief for you, maybe not for others who were cheering you before, but that obviously brings with it a different kind of freedom. So we want real talk here, don't we, people? Yeah, we want real talk. So what can you tell this room, Jacinda? What can you reveal to this room that you couldn't have said in your prime ministership or in cabinet? The floor is yours.
Well, you know what? I'd like to think that I was always pretty open and honest and spoke my mind. I'd like to think that. Sometimes I was hot-mic'd and might have said too much. But you know, as I was listening to this incredible panel of people with lived experience and family in conflict who are still living with the ongoing trauma of conflict, I couldn't help but feel the responsibility, I think, that never leaves you when you're in politics or when you're in the periphery of politics. And one thing that occurred to me while I was listening to you is that we talk a lot about the systems and the failure of the system and therefore what needs to change about the system. And yet, as I was listening, I thought to myself, but the conflict, the occupation, what we are talking about now is illegal. It is illegal. Illegal wars are underway right now around the world. So we have seen the breach of the systems and the rules and the international rule-based order that we all built over years of experience of conflict and war and harm. We see that now being breached. Is it a failure of system or is it a failure of leadership? It is a failure of leadership. And so I didn't expect after I left politics to talk to anyone about leadership, because I don't think just because you've led a country that means then that you're the person that can go out and lecture others. I don't think that. However, I do see a rise out there in the world right now of a particular style of leadership that frankly gets framed, rightly so, as authoritarian, or for want of a better word, strongman leadership, and a diminishing of the kind of leadership that is people-centered, that is based on humanity, that is empathetic and compassionate. And people who believe in that strongman authoritarian style will say that empathetic leadership is weak. Well, I have one response to that. Empathy never started a war. It never sought to do harm. It never sought to diminish the rights or the well-being of others. And so we exist right now in a failure of leadership. And what I think is critical right now is that we don't start lowering our expectation of politics and politicians. We need to maintain the expectation that we should have an international rules-based order, that we should have leaders who are brave enough to act empathetically, that we should seek consensus and transparency and integrity, and none of this should be lost in our political system during these times where all of those things are framed as weak, when actually all of those things are courageous. And so my point right now was build up those who lead with empathy, support women into politics, and never lower your expectation of the political system that they are a part of.
Sora, what do you make of those sorts of sentiments, and what's your big ask of leaders at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with some of your points, and thank you for what you said. Expectations should be there, but I think it also then again shifts the responsibility and all the hard work on us. We're always fighting, we're always trying to find solutions, something that works for us. But I think one thing is clear, that the change within the system, we've tried it, it's not responding. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We had the law, we had the legal frameworks, and Afghanistan now has peace. But does that mean lack of bombs? Is that just lack of war? Do Afghan women are in peace now? Didn't the Taliban just pass another decree that legalizes domestic violence? And how about lesbian, bisexual, and trans women in Afghanistan? And all these violence that we are documenting every single day in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iran, in Turkey, against LGBTQ women, they do not come from air. I mean, these are all foundational structural issues. Even before the taking over of the Taliban, we documented all this violence against women in Afghanistan. And now I think the question is why then a woman is experiencing shaved eyebrows and shaved hair because of their gender identity and sexual orientation in Afghanistan. And when did we get to the point that for us that is acceptable and that is okay? So I think I don't want to repeat things that everyone knows, right? I think the reason we're here is to still try to figure out a solution, something that is working on the ground by front workers, by activists, by social workers, and it is working for us. So all we are asking is resources, redistribution of those resources, getting in the rooms where these discussions and decisions that affect our lives are happening. We need to be in those rooms. The doors are always locked for us, and we do not understand why that is, right? So asking the system that is protecting itself so fiercely has never gotten us anywhere, right? And we're frustrated and we're tired, but we still are expected to show resilience, to still keep fighting, right? And we still do, but we have no expectations at this point.
That is a very, very grim picture. Tamam, what do you make of that? That there's no expectations? When you think about systems which were built in certain ways to exclude others that are failing your people at the moment, who do you trust to fix it?
I don't trust political leadership. I don't trust political leaders. In Palestine, we saw Israel has received the largest number of UN resolutions against it. 6 rulings by the ICC, rulings, arrest warrants by the ICJ, countless reports and statements by UN bodies, human rights organizations from Palestine and beyond. A live stream genocide, nothing has changed on the ground. I don't think that after 7 decades of colonial occupation and many other atrocities all around the world, we can call it a failure of implementation or a failure of political leadership. This is, for me, I see it as a feature of the system itself. This system that is very much based, that works on US vetoes. US can veto just anything. The majority of court rulings are non-binding. The weight of vetoes are not balanced. So there are no enforcement measures. And I think as long as there are no enforcement measures, there can be never accountability. This justice will be just endlessly denied and delayed. And I see it as this system of legality has been just used as a tool of performance, just to claim that we are democratic nations, and we allow people and states to go to courts and so on and so forth. But in reality, there is no substance. There are no deliverables. As we're sitting here in Australia, even at the opening of this activist conference, we had the governor of the Commonwealth of Australia who praised its army, who apparently bombs people with care and compassion. But this very army has even expanded its defense cooperation with Israel amidst its ongoing genocide on Gaza. What a shame. So I think, yeah, we have to stop asking why this is not enforced. We have, and we know who it's benefiting, this lack of enforcement. We have to think a little bit more and act more on what we can do all together. We have to act. Time is running.
Thank you so much, Tamam. Jacinda, you've heard there testimony, first-hand testimony from women whose lives are affected. They're direct consequences of decisions made in rooms like the ones that you got to attend, that the door was open to, tables you got to sit at. I'm just wondering, because it's such a bleak picture that's been painted, that's the grim reality of it, do you still have hope that things will get better?
You know, I don't know that you can survive in politics without being an optimist. I think the alternative way that people survive is by being a narcissist. And the majority of politicians I worked with, at least in the New Zealand system, the majority of them were motivated by making the place in which they lived better. That was my experience. But the reason that I maintain optimism is because I don't see it as naivety. I see it as an expectation, and I refuse to give up my expectation that we can and must do better, because I worry that the alternative is indifference. And the moment we give up, politicians will sense we've given up, and then their delivery lowers. The expectation of what they do whilst in office and whilst holding power lowers as well. Now, let me be clear, of course, the experience sitting here, I mean, it is hard not, of course, to be pessimistic in the current environment. And when we look at the national surveys, the international surveys of where our voters are, they're not just pessimistic and polarized. They don't believe the next generation is going to be better off than the last. And unfortunately, according to the last Edelman Global Survey, that has caused them to move towards insularity, a belief that they no longer trust anyone else either. So we are at a low point. If it feels bad, it's because it is bad. But the only way out is if we continue to do what we can in the communities in which we live and call upon the leaders in the community in which we live to do what they are expected to as well. I would never push accountability down to individual voters and individual communities. Of course, the expectation needs to be on those who lead. So my last thought would be, we have to do both at the same time. There are women who are continuing to live, grieve, raise children in conflict right now. We have to be aware of their reality and do what we can for them. So in this moment in time, whether or not you're in a safer birth consortium or whether you're working on intimate partner violence or wherever you are, that work in the here and now is so critical. We must fight the battle on two fronts, end conflict, war, and so on, whilst also being aware of the reality of those who are currently living in it. So wherever you are in the system, as we would say in New Zealand, kia kaha, be strong, keep going, but don't drop your expectations. Please, demand more.
Don't drop your expectations and demand more. I've certainly gotten a lot out of this panel. Please thank Tamam, Zora, Jacinda, and Layla. Thank you so much. Thank you. Wow. What an incredible What a powerhouse way to wrap up the final plenary of this incredible event, but we're not done just yet. We came here with a question about whose lives are negotiable. We leave you with an answer, not theirs, not the women you've heard of today, not the women leading the responses to the conflict right now, with nothing but their own determination. The gap between that truth and what the international system delivers is not an accident. We know, we've heard it today, it's a choice. And we end this plenary not with an institution making a promise, not with any sort of motherhood statement, but with a woman who started this conversation, Noor.
The world calls it the Rohingya genocide. But for Rohingya mothers, it was the smell of their villages burning. It was running through smoke, carrying children in their arms, while bullets were being fired. It was not knowing which child they could save if one of them fell. It was the sound of people screaming and then suddenly not. That was my mother. She ran with 5 children. She crossed borders with nothing. She made impossible choices so I could survive. And that is how we ended up in Malaysia, where I grew up as a refugee, 8.5 years of not existing on paper, of running from police, of nights in jungles where every sound felt like danger. That is what conflict looks like for women. Not theory, not language, not resolutions. It starts in Myanmar, where women have been gang raped, where girls as young as 6, their bodies used as weapons of war. And it does not end there. It looks like Rohingya mothers in camps in Indonesia, sleeping under torn tarps, with nothing between their children and the rain. It looks like Rohingya mothers stuck in detention in Malaysia, separated from their children. It looks like girls in Thailand sold into sexual exploitation and their bodies turned into currency because of being stateless. This is what we mean when we say crimes against humanity. And still, the world discusses. Still, the world negotiates. Still, the perpetrators in Myanmar remain in power today. Rohingya women have told their stories over and over again to journalists, to investigators, to the United Nations. We have given the world evidence. But evidence without action is another form of violence. Because what is happening to Rohingya women is not unique. Across the world, women are not just caught in conflict. They are deliberately targeted through their bodies, their roles, and their futures. Right now, women in Palestine, Sudan, Uyghur, Congo, West Papua, Kurdistan, Yazidi, Kashmir, Tibet, Elam Tamil, Haiti, Balochistan, Hazara, Iran, Ukraine, Taiwan, Myanmar, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and First Nations women in Australia, and First Nations peoples worldwide are living through these same patterns of violence, erasure, and impunity. And just because it is not on the news does not mean women are not being subjected to genocidal violence. These are not slogans, these are lives. So my final plea to the leaders in this room is simple.
Do not leave Women Deliver thinking your job is done because you listened. Listening has never saved us. Action does. Close the gaps that allow these crimes to continue. Make justice real. Put power into the hands of the women who are already surviving, leading, and resisting. Because for women in conflict and genocide, this is not about policy. It is about whether they live or die, and whether tomorrow finally comes.